Tonight, we're going to be covering a topic, and it is going to get a little bit uncomfortable, and it is going to get a little bit sensitive at certain points. In my career, I was a creative director, with the awards, all that sort of thing. I was also, a front-end developer. I was in management, in a couple design firms, But then about 4 years ago, I switched over and became an accessibility professional. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to do this full time. And that said, I also kind of play the role of caregiver from time to time with my mother, who's 93 years old. So there's a certain perspective into aging, and myself, I'm not that young anymore. So I put myself in the category of being an aging human. But Marcelo Paiva is here, and he and I run a meetup group, IXDA Miami, and we get to do a lot of these sort of meetups all the time. And I have to say, this is probably one of the things I enjoy absolutely the most of lockdown and this pandemic. So it's great to see Marcelo here, and it's great to see all these familiar faces, and I hope we get to do this more often. So let me change the tone a little bit, maybe get a little bit somber on you folks. And so let's start our journey, and we're going to go back in time about 80 years ago. And 80 years ago, on a Saturday afternoon in the Mississippi Delta, and there's a photograph that was taken by a young photographer of a man walking the stairs up into a movie theater. So we're gonna, this picture is kind of like stuck with me quite a bit, and the picture really has a lot of different components and elements to it. So first, let's talk a little bit about the photographer. She was all of 29 years old when she took this photograph, and she was on assignment with a branch of the government, the Farm Security Administration, that really, its mission was to kind of document the sort of poverty that you had in rural America. So here she is in this photograph. She's on assignment in Kentucky, and she's shooting 3 kids, in a hillbilly house, or she describes it, she's shooting mountain children, which almost sounds like mountain lions or puma or something. But this Saturday afternoon that she's in Mississippi, she was on assignment, and she's probably covering the Black workers in Mississippi. And I don't know if her intent with this photograph was to document discrimination. I feel like her intent when she was taking this photograph is this is what a Black man would have done on his day off from hard work, and he would have gone into a movie theater, and she's documenting this. But in that, you also see the fact that you've got blatant segregation going on here. So you've got, for instance, you've got the stairs that takes someone upstairs. And then if you can see it on your screen, there's a very small sign on that left-hand door that says white men only for the restroom. So the reason I'm including this is not really to make anybody uncomfortable, but really to raise the whole point that this sort of segregation or this sort of discrimination just was so prevalent that somebody wouldn't have noticed it. So it would have been so common that you would have totally overlooked it. In fact, so common that you have a corporate sponsor for it. So you've got a big old Dr. Pepper sign here on top of this, on top of the stairway, that says colored administration. Now, if this were 2020, and you had this sort of blatant segregation, and you had your brand associated with it, chances are that would have triggered like a massive boycott or some sort of divestment. The company would have had to do some sort of apology or retraction. If for instance, a celebrity had made a remark that was anything like this, they would have had a retraction. They probably would have fired that celebrity. So this photograph would have set off a whole sort of firestorm. But I think what you should notice here is that sort of sponsorship or that sort of corporate association with what's going on whatever was going on was so normal that nobody would have thought twice about it. So let's, fast forward today. I mean, there are certain types of segregation that we have that we feel like totally normal and we feel totally comfortable with. So here we have, for instance, a VIP lounge in a Latin American airport. And this is segregation based on an ability to pay. So it's an oasis of calm, but it's not an oasis of calm for everyone. It's an oasis of calm for that class of passengers that has shown a willingness and an ability to pay more for the privilege of having this. Here's another sample of a two-class system where you have an express lane, and the express lane has certain fees that are associated with it. So you have a fee for those who can pay, and then you have a rest of an expressway for those who can't pay. And so this is here in Atlanta, and you see the fees going up to $13.95. So kind of as the fees go up or as the fees change, it starts raising these interesting ethical issues as to, what is okay? What's the ceiling? I mean, how would you feel if the fee to go on that express lane was $139.50? Let's say we just add a zero to it. Does that totally change the dynamic of this? Does this turn into, the billionaires lane and everybody else? Well, what if it isn't the billionaires lane? What if it's the billionaires 3 lanes? And then all of us have to cram into the remaining like 2 or 3 lanes that are there. I mean, what does that do to, to the whole system? What does it do? Or let's just take a second and start thinking like, well, how would it make us feel if we were in the slow lanes? Would it make you feel a feeling of exclusion? Would you make it feel marginalized? What if this happened all the time? What if it happened so much that you started feeling that the highways actually weren't designed for you? The highways actually were built for everyone else. How would that make you feel? So let's take that feeling of exclusion, let's kind of bottle it up for a little bit, and let's actually move on a little bit and start talking about other forms that discrimination can take in our society. There we go, much better. So what you won't find is this. You won't find a sign that says we cater to the able trade only. But you might as well have this on most digital properties that are out there. Let's take a look at one example, for instance, Domino's.com. So in 2016, Domino's was sued by the National Federation for the Blind because their site did not work for blind people. And, if you're blind, you basically cannot use Domino's.com to order pizza. And Domino's responded that, the laws for the Americans with Disabilities Act, the laws that are there for access, for accessibility, do not apply to us here at Domino's. So essentially, what they decided is they raised a legal challenge to it, and it went back and forth. And what they were hoping for was that this was going to go back and forth up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court saw this case and said, you know what? We're not going to rule on it. We're going to let the lower court the lower court decision on this stand, and we're not going to rule on this. And the lower court decision essentially was one saying that no, the ADA does apply in this instance, and Domino's needs to create a website that works for people who are blind. But the crux of this is, okay, you're running a major brand like Domino's, and maybe people with disabilities are actually your high value customers. Maybe people who can't drive, who have difficulty cooking meals for themselves and need repeatedly to order out for food. Maybe those people are high value customers for you. So from this point of view, I mean, Domino's strategy really couldn't have been like any more short-sighted. So another form of discrimination, a application that makes you, restaurant reservation application that also doesn't work for blind people. And so this case in California, White versus Square, and in White v. Square, they found that the company that set up the website, actually no, the restaurant that owned the website that used this software was liable because they had not vetted the software properly enough. And so they had chosen a vendor with inaccessible software. So the restaurant actually was responsible for this and liable for this. And so this starts raising a bunch of issues in terms of discrimination, because the restaurants, the clients in our world are the ones who hold the responsibility. But we, the designers, the digital agencies, the software vendors, the makers, the third-party vendors, I mean, none of us really carry the same sort of responsibility that the end clients do. And so this becomes this sort of self-perpetuating cycle, because the makers of stuff like WordPress and other organizations don't feel the tremendous pressure to create accessible product because they're not the entity that's being sued. So what else does discrimination look like now? You've probably heard this before at some point or another. Hey, blind people don't use our website, or blind people don't use our app. Or you could see, oh, well, these are edge cases, or, hey, accessibility is not in our budget, or it's not core to our mission, or it's not MVP. So MVP, if, just a quick refresher, is minimum viable product. But if you're shipping minimum viable product, is it viable if a large percentage of the population can't use it? I mean, to me, it just baffles common sense. I mean, you really, if you're shipping your first rev of a product, you should make sure that you don't have a significant portion of your audience that can't use it. Otherwise, it's just kind of like, why are you doing that? Here's another probably more subtle form of discrimination. And let me walk you through this. So this is, picture, if you will, this sort of hierarchy of UX. So we're going to start from the bottom. So the bottom is like, hey, can you read the content that's on the page? That's pretty basic, right? Like if you're building product, if people can't read what's on your page, or they can't read your marketing materials, then it's kind of like you're wasting your time. So next level up is, okay, you have a digital product. Is it operable? Can you work it? Can you work the controls and stuff like that? Next level up is it understandable? Is it usable? Does it make sense? And so most of us would kind of say, all right, that is the threshold for a product. Like, that's like the minimum product that we would build for people using it, who are abled, right? And then we start going up into like, hey, it's nicer than just minimal. Is it nice enough that we can brag about it? And let's assign that a letter grade of a B. And then, finally, will it win awards? And so that is kind of like the sweet spot that every digital agency would like to be in. Every digital agency would like to be in a space, where they're getting A or A minus sort of work for all their projects. It's either award winning or it's brag worthy. And this is kind of like where all of us as UX designers really feel like we want to operate. But let's look at how this plays out in the real world for people with disability. So we've got the award-winning digital experiences, which are like the A and B sort of letter grade sites or digital experiences. Our baseline is that C, which is like, is it usable? But if we're looking at the web and the stuff that's out there, about 90% of the web, 98% of the web is in F territory. And we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail later. But, people say, hey, let's build accessible product. Let's make stuff that's WCAG compliant. WCAG compliant is a D, okay? It doesn't even ensure that a product is understandable. It just makes sure that the controls are operable, and it makes sure that the text that's on the page actually can be read. I mean, that's basically it. So when we say, hey, we aim for a product that's compliant or that's ADA compliant, I mean, really we're setting the bar incredibly low. And to have, to me, to have a standard for people who are abled which you see on the left, and a standard for people with disabilities, which is what you see on the right, have such a disparity to that, to me, that's just essentially a form of discrimination in and of itself. So that gap that we're talking about, well, there's a usability gap there, which is between what is WCAG compliant and essentially what is excellent. And one of the things that I hope we get around to talking about either later tonight or at some point, in a future meetup, is how do we close that gap? How do we get us designers to start thinking of, what, we're going to build, like, say, a banking app that isn't just excellent for people who are sighted. Let's build a banking app that's great for people, who are blind. Or it's so intuitive and it's so wonderful that somebody with like severe cognitive difficulties or struggles would be able to work with this. So, how do we do this? I mean, is it going to take us creating a specific awards competition for sites? Is it going to be able to, create a category for accessibility in the Webbies or something? I mean, what is it going to take to motivate agencies to be able to close that sort of usability gap that's there? All right, let me switch gears on you, and we're going to talk about a few sort of like basic concepts. Yeah, I like that people are thinking Stark Award. That's exactly kind of where I was hinting at. Awesome. So let's talk about the difference between disabilities, impairments, and mismatches. So here we have a sort of continuum of abilities. So we have somebody with extremely limited physical abilities. In this case, it's actually a former NFL player in this photograph, but who had an injury and became quadriplegic. You also see a photo of my mom there, who is not quite as severely limited in her mobility, but she's a pretty sharp cookie, and she's pretty much with it still, even in her 90s. And I'm in the middle, somewhere between my mom and Usain Bolt, the fastest man on earth, and below superheroes for sure. But if you think about this as a spectrum of abilities, and you start thinking, okay, where's the cutoff for disability? The issue is there is no cutoff. There is a government definition of what constitutes a disability, but we're all just kind of on the spectrum someplace, okay? Our view, the way we think of disability really comes from a sort of government sort of origins. In the United States, our view of disability kind of comes out of the sort of government policies that came out after the American Civil War in Reconstruction. So the whole thing was, we want to give benefits to veterans who fought in the Civil War. The government wants to provide for them, wants to show its gratitude, but who deserves that sort of gratitude and who deserves those sorts of funds? So the whole notion of disability was based on a very obvious, permanent, sort of impairment. So it was amputation, it was some sort of like really huge sort of impairment to your physical ability. So a lot of people term this the medical model, and this is a sort of notion that most of us grew up with in terms of what disability is. There's another model that I want to bring up, which is also the charity model, which is kind of like, the way you kind of treat poor people, like, hey, people with disabilities, you have pity on them, you have fundraisers for them, you cheer them when they have a little bit of ability, but in general, they're to be pitied, okay? You don't think necessarily of really improving the position of them to be equals to you. Now, this kind of takes a little bit of a Zen-like sort of twist on how you see the world here, which is the social model. And the social model, which kind of originated in England in the 1970s, is that the problem, it's not your physical impairment, it's the barriers that we create as a society. And so essentially, for somebody who's a double amputee, like you saw from the Civil War, his ability to be independent and a fully functional and economically productive member of society has nothing to do with him having legs or not. It has to do with the fact that, do you have curb cuts? Do you have elevators? Do you have basically ways for him to operate a forklift or heavy machinery without using his feet? So it starts becoming a whole slew of things that the problem of people with disabilities often comes from the fact that society is not designed for them, okay? And we have a room full of designers here. So it's not a coincidence that I'm bringing this up. So we as designers, or we as members of this sort of society, we basically are perpetuating this model of disability. So if anyone here can't see, the cartoon here has a square pointing to something with a square hole and says, hey, you're going to have to change to fit into the system. And there are all these circles looking at it going like, hey, how about you change the system so we can fit? So, you could have a square with like a little circle cut out within the square so that everybody could fit. So that is the way we need to kind of start looking at things and seeing how we design the system. Do we as designers contribute to that perpetuation of squareness that impedes people, the circles, from actually being able to participate in society? So the other thing you want to think about is not every impairment is permanent. So we've been talking about disabilities in the sense of amputations and permanent things. So let's just look at maybe the first group of illustrations here. And this is actually from Microsoft's Inclusive Design Handbook. And for those of you who are new to accessibility, if there's one thing I would encourage you guys to look at and a starting point, it would be looking at the inclusive design materials on Microsoft.com. So you have, for instance, the situation where somebody could have one arm. And so that means that every piece of equipment, every piece of hardware that they ever use has to have a single-handed mode to it. So that could be an Xbox, that could be a Nintendo. I mean, that could be anything. But you're permanently in a situation where you can only have one hand. You could be temporarily in that situation where you have your arm in a sling, or maybe you have your hand inside of a cast or something. So you're in a position where you can't use that hand. And again, that's the same use case for single hand mode. You could have a new parent or somebody who's carrying a baby, or somehow has their hand somehow engaged. And the fact that they can use a single hand, like, if we're carrying something and we've got a phone, the ability to have a single hand mode to a digital application is it's a real plus. So you want to think of these as like, when you're designing to work for a disability or an impairment, it doesn't have to be a permanent one, because the permanent ones, those are not as frequent, but we all run into situations where we can't sometimes do something because our physical abilities aren't quite up to it. I'll give you another example. You have cataracts, and if you run a simulator on, like there's a No Coffee plugin that lets you run simulators on different visual conditions. If you run the simulator for cataracts, it looks an awful lot like a dirty window, or like, like think of scuba goggles, with like salt or with brine on them, that really starts changing, affecting your ability to see and your ability to see in certain lights. So this is an issue, for instance, of the cruise company, that I work for. We build apps, and I want to push people to have more contrast, not because of people with low vision necessarily, but because that higher contrast also helps you if you're up on the top deck, your phone is smeared with suntan lotion, and you're in broad daylight. So more contrast in applications isn't necessarily for somebody with visual deficiencies. It actually helps everyone. So we should start thinking about different modalities of how we build stuff and how we design stuff, not as like we're doing a charity for somebody who's an edge case, but really because we're helping everybody, including ourselves. So what's the takeaway? That disability, it's not just a personal health condition. It really, a disability, in this sense, is a mismatch between whatever your abilities are and the task at hand. So it could be that you just have a crushing hangover or something, that you're unable to function. But essentially, you need to look at situational disabilities as being more of a mismatch than anything else. Let me go into maybe talking about a couple other more sort of basic principles. And this is kind of, like if you ever did mathematics, you have postulates and you have theorems. So these are the postulates. First of all, that everyone has the right to live independently. And so we want to try to extend this right to as many people as you possibly can. Next, that the built world should be free of barriers. Now, maybe you allow a couple barriers, like for instance, you're building stuff on a steep mountainside, or you're building, we were talking about cliff dwellings earlier today. Maybe you allow for a few of those sorts of barriers, but the built world where we put value, there are no barriers. Like for instance, you may have trouble in a wheelchair getting up a building across the street, but I tell you, if you jumped in your car right now and decided to cross the entire continent that you're on in your car, you probably wouldn't even hit a single curb or any large bumps that you would have to go over. So where we place value, we don't have those barriers. And then, in the digital world, it's part of that built world, and there's no excuse for us to leave barriers in it, because the digital world is 100% man-made. So the only barriers that exist in the digital world are of man's own creation, or humankind's own creation, sorry. So let me let that sit with you for a second. Then let's talk about, if we build in access, right? And if we're talking about accessibility, access can be as elegant as the rest of your experience. And so, we'll approach things like orthopedic equipment. When was the last time you saw a walker that was beautiful? We have such a disrespect as designers for products that affect people with disabilities. There are so many wonderful design opportunities of products that really need to be designed better, of user experiences that really need to be designed better. There is no reason why, for instance, artificial limbs have to be that really disgusting putty flesh color. There's no reason why products have to be as made as uninspiring as they are right now. But there's also the whole thing that if you build in accessibility from the beginning, and if you plan for it from the beginning, you can have a beautiful and elegant end product. So here we're looking at a sink, and we have two young Asian girls that are looking over the sink, and they're able to wash their hands because the sink is lower for them. So what happens if you don't plan for accessibility from the start? This is an actual example from a major airport in Texas. And here you have a step stool that you basically pull out. It's metal. You pull it out from underneath the sink and you stand on it. It's disgusting. I mean, and this is, like designers, like, hey, if you design an app and then you have to retrofit it for accessibility, this is what the end product is going to look like. Developers, if you have beautiful code and it's elegant and it's wonderfully worked, and then somebody comes in like with requirements that to you seem like they're out of left field for accessibility, your code is going to be a bunch of spaghetti code, which is going to be about as equally as attractive or as elegant as this. So bolt-on accessibility is a failure. The other thing is it's very expensive. It's so much less expensive to design in accessibility from the start than to actually bring it in as an afterthought at the end. I don't know if any of you saw the story about the Hyperloop last week, okay? So they just did the first test of the Hyperloop. They got two people in one of these pods and they shoved it down a vacuum tube, kind of like those things you have at the bank, for the drive-through windows. So shoved them down the tube at 107 miles an hour for, I guess, half a mile, quarter of a mile, whatever it was. But they built this beautiful, elegant sort of pod. And they had this wonderful photo op with two of their publicity executives there who, they look pretty buff for their age and stuff. And they designed it like a capsule in science fiction. And they designed it with that circular hatch that you see there, right? So this is kind of being touted by Virgin, and it kind of was originally dreamed up by Elon Musk as public transportation. Now, this is public transportation that makes no reference to people with disabilities. So it's something, this futuristic sort of thing that's made in there, but it's not designed for actual use cases. So this is public transportation where really, if you're talking as designers, okay, we all know this. Like, if you don't design for your most difficult or trying use case, you're gonna have to find that you're gonna have to go back to the drawing board, and you're gonna have to completely rethink your design or rethink something. You're gonna forget like that one assumption that's gonna come back and kick you in the ass, and then you're gonna regret the fact that you forgot it in the first place. So how do you get a 300-pound wheelchair into that pod? Because that's really what you should be designing for if you're talking about like building for public transportation. I saw this and I was like, wait a minute, this is like yet another ableist product that's being built. I mean, it's a product that could have eventual use, but really, like, I'm not impressed by this until you have a flat roll-in entrance and you have a way of having somebody with a 300-pound wheelchair being able to work this application well. Otherwise, we're just basically doing a photo op with somebody else's science fiction fantasy there. And this is like, you know, we're just kind of like reliving some sort of, you know, scene out of Barbarella or 2001: A Space Odyssey. So it's not truly about public transportation. And this is where I take issue with Hyperloop here. So maybe I'm the only one that gets upset over this, but, you know, just these are sort of eyes in which that I see this.
Claudio, I don't want to interrupt for too long here, but as soon as you posted it, I kept asking, what if you have a medical need, an anxiety attack? What if you needed to go to the restroom? I have just so many questions about, you know, being enclosed in a capsule like that with no access to anybody to help you, to assist you, or even if you're able to get in or not. So yeah, even basic things like that.
Yeah, it's like riding the Green Line in Boston, getting stuck in Back Bay in the tunnel. Like that's something that happened to me all the time. I'm sure New Yorkers have the exact equivalent of this. It's like, you know, hey, you have claustrophobia, you have to go to the bathroom. Well, you're just SOL. You know, that's just part of the public transportation experience. But yeah, and you know, it's not. With a Hyperloop, it's not exactly something that you can walk out of because, you know, maybe the next exit point is like 30 miles away or something. So yeah, no, you start raising a bunch of really interesting questions there, Alberto, and maybe this is a solution that's better for cargo than it is for humans, or maybe we need to work some of these things out. Maybe there has to be restrooms on there, you know, but there's a lot of unanswered questions for humans in general, let alone people with disabilities there. But again, those things should not be afterthoughts. Those should be things that you're designing into your primary solution. Otherwise, you're going to have to completely reconfigure your primary solution. Damn it, I gave this one away. So this is really the state of the web right now. And if you say, like, let's say you run an accessibility checker and you get like a score of 75%, right? Well, look at these stairs. These stairs would get a score of 75% too with an accessibility checker. You know, you got your ramp that takes you up 75% of the steps. Where does that leave you? It leaves you with 3 steps that you still can't get over. So there's almost no use to having partial accessibility. You really need to commit to having full accessibility. But remember also, I mean, full WCAG compliance is not usability for everyone. It's not universal usability for people with disabilities. So there is that gap there that you want to be aware of. So let me hit you, came up with this 98% number earlier. This is where the 98% number came from. So there's this research institute in Utah, WebAIM, and WebAIM ran. They make the Wave web checker, the plugin, and so they ran an automation script that ran on the top 1 million most trafficked homepages on the web. And they looked at how many of those had accessibility issues and how many of those, would meet compliance. And what they found was that 98.1% and growing had accessibility issues or potential barriers to keep people with disabilities from using it. So if you want to have, an accessibility lawsuit and you want to sue somebody for an inaccessible website, I mean, you could just literally just throw stones someplace and you're going to hit an inaccessible website. So this is like a really appalling state of affairs. As a matter of fact, what WebAIM found was an average of 60.9 errors per page. 61 errors. Can you imagine if we, for instance, had content on pages and we had an average of 61 spelling mistakes on a page? Like, we would have no credibility in any of these sort of sites. And we would be just absolutely appalled at this sort of experience. But this is pretty much where the state of the web is right now. And what I really feel strongly is that this is the product of the sort of systemic ableism that we're going to be talking about tonight. So who does this affect? We have this number of 30.3. So most people will talk about 1 in 5 people having a disability. If you only look at adults over the age of 18, the answer is actually 30.3%. And these are people who have either a severe disability or a mild disability, but the definition that the Census Bureau used on this study was whether or not you needed some sort of assistance to go through the tasks, the activities of daily life. So they abbreviate that as ADL. So people who have trouble with ADL were those that were listed in this. So say, for instance, you get your 80-year-old Nana, your grandmother who can pretty much get around on her own. She's fairly lucid, but she needs help maybe bathing, or maybe her eyesight isn't so good and she needs help reading stuff from time to time. Would she consider herself disabled? No, because if you asked her she was disabled, she would think of the Civil War veteran in the wheelchair, like, I have both my legs, I can get around, but I can only get around maybe as an 80-something-year-old would, and I would not consider myself a person with a disability. I would consider myself a person maybe that needs a little bit of extra help. So let's look at the sort of distribution of disabilities over different age groups. So once you get over the age of 65, more than half of Americans would fall into this definition of being disabled. And these numbers, as we start getting into things like, diabetes and different sorts of epidemics, these numbers will probably start rising. They also probably start rising as we Americans start becoming more open about our physical conditions, and we can admit to things, for instance, like anxiety, any sort of mental health disorders that are essentially a taboo to talk about right now. So one of the sort of conclusions that you want to take from this sort of graphic is kind of that you start in the gray part where you're fully abled, and as life goes on, they may run into an event, you may run into a disease, a trauma, or something that essentially pushes you over that sort of threshold, which is arbitrary anyway, into the pink area of people with disabilities. Now, if you start using the same criteria for people over the age of 90, that percentage now becomes something like 95 or 98% of people having a disability. So at some point or another, you have to think of crossing over into that other sector. So for us as designers, really, you want to think of, if you're designing something that's accessible and works for people with disabilities, you're also designing for your future self. And if you're not designing for your future self, well, then you're designing for yourself with some sort of a temporary impairment, some sort of situational impairment where you can't work it and you need to switch over to some other mode to be able to work your product. So if you build for that 30%, or if you build for those folks with disabilities, everybody wins. And here are a few sort of inventions that came up for people with disabilities: automatic doors, even typewriters, actually, hands-free fixtures, curb cuts, things like autocompletes, captions on videos or captions on the TV when you're in a bar, voice UI, a screen that you can see in broad daylight, or dark themes. I mean, these are all products that at some point or another were originally conceived of and developed for people with disabilities, but actually serve the general product or the general public. So we have to think of this not as edge cases, but that it's kind of like the Hyperloop with the 300-pound wheelchair, that if you design for your most difficult use case, you're going to come up with the solution that's going to be superior, it's going to be more universal, and it's going to serve abled people that much better. So, I feel like I'm missing half the presentation because like the chat is just scrolling away. I'm sure there's some good stuff. Alberto, is there anything there that like I should stop for that's that good, or should I just catch up tomorrow?
What do you mean?
I think there's one question that was asked earlier by Matthias, where he said he wanted you to touch on the point that all barriers are human made, because there was a lot to unpack there. Matthias, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what you said.
Most barriers are human made, just as the Buddha would say, that we are the causes of our own suffering, and but I think when it comes to the digital world, I mean, really, the digital world doesn't exist except as a construct built by humans. So if there's barriers in there, it's not because there's some natural force. There's not a mountain range or a river or an earthquake causing that barrier. The barrier is basically our lack of foresight. So that's that, but I think we could have an entire evening in which we just start talking about man-made barriers. Okay, I'm going to jump into the law, and I know I've got a break worked into this, and I think it's like actually I know it's right after this segment. So let's give you a little bit more background on the law in the United States. In 1965, we had the American Civil Rights Law that came in that granted voting rights to people. It effectively really tried to eliminate most forms of systemic discrimination that you had in the United States. Well, people with disabilities understood the spirit of this. They understood the spirit of civil rights laws, but really felt like they needed a law that worked specifically for them. And so as a result of some major protesting and a major activism, in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed by President George Herbert Walker Bush, as you see here. And so this year is the 30th anniversary of that law being signed into place. And that law pretty much has like a scope where it affects all of our buildings, it affects all of our built world from a physical world, in terms of sort of standards that you need for public accommodations for people. So it's a very significant law. I know the Europeans have very similar laws, and I think there's kind of equivalents to these in most countries. What does it cover? Well, it covers public accommodations. It covers also workplace accommodations, things like how do you get into the work. It also starts covering things like software or the sort of tools that you use and the requirements that employers have to be able to allow people with disabilities to perform their jobs. Now, here we start getting into an interesting new frontier for the ADA, because the ADA was written in 1990, and if you recall, the World Wide Web really didn't start becoming popular until about like 1993, 1994. So it predated this, so there is no language in the ADA that specifically speaks to digital experiences. And this is what Domino's tried using as a defense. So rather than, serve their customers who were blind, they were just saying like, nope, we don't have to, and we're going to spend a ton of money on attorneys instead of spending it on fixing our site, because we feel like, you know, this is the way we want to go about it. But really, little by little in the American courts, this is kind of changing, you know, where websites, apps, kiosks have, you know, little by little, these are being defined in ways that need to match the ADA. And websites are actually probably like the last like giant gray area. But the ADA also applies to like VR, it applies to games. And there's a whole set of legislation out there, you know, specific to ATM machines. In 2010, the 21st Century Video Accessibility Act came about. And here you see President Obama signing this. And yes, that is Stevie Wonder in the background there, looking over his shoulder. But the CVAA is this law that really isn't that well known. But it applies, the way it was written, it applies to video and broadcast communications. But if you really look at the law, essentially it could be applied to anything that has an IP address. So the CVAA, in it, they have a set of performance objectives. So performance objectives, what does this mean? Well, it basically means like, hey, if you're going to build software, if you build a digital experience, these are the sort of requirements that it needs to meet. So if you're building an app, well, you have to be able to work it if you're blind and you have no vision, or if you can't hear at all, or if you have little or no color perception, or if you have limited manual dexterity and you can't work a mouse, or you can't work a keyboard. You know, your digital experience still needs to be operable with limited reach and strength. So if you have a kiosk, you need to make it accessible or workable for somebody who's very low down, like in a wheelchair, or somebody who is a little person. So they have standards for how high up or how far down you can position the active controls on a kiosk. It needs to be operable with a prosthetic device. Now, if you remember the very first touch screens, you know, remember you had to have like glove mode or something so that you would be able to touch it and work it. And this is an issue, for instance, in our cruise company for apps, for instance, for housekeeping. Like if you have a digital app on a tablet, they're not going to have to be taking off their gloves every single time they want to interact with the tablet. So that starts becoming a defining factor for the software. Also, it needs to have a modality that's operable without speech. So if you start looking at these sort of 10 performance objectives, I mean, I personally view these as really the 10 commandments for inclusive design. These are really like the fundamental core use cases that we UX designers should be building for and designing for. And I think they should be kind of like etched in our brains. But you may not be able to use universal design where you have one experience that satisfies all of these different conditions. So really what this comes down to is having maybe different modalities for being able to address maybe clusters of these or groups of these. So maybe you have a voice UX or a voice UI for one part of this, but then again, you also have a visual text equivalent for this. So that this is kind of the gist of where the CVAA goes. So I'm going to take a little short break here. You know, maybe we should take about 5 minutes or so. Maybe run to our fridges, grab a drink or something. Gives me maybe a second to catch up with I don't even think I could catch up with this chat in 5 minutes.
Claudio, can I before you take the break? Can I hijack your break?
Sure.
Joe asked an important question. He describes it as a holistic question regarding designing and building towards accessibility, and it is how can we mitigate the gap that exists between cheap versus expensive, where accessible is more often than not the latter, where people see this as dollars and cents and an extra cost to their operation, basically.
Yeah, and Alberto, on building upon that is not only on designing for mobile applications or websites, but rather in product development. Because if you think about the sink on that picture before, it's much more expensive to build two sinks with different heights than just building one with the regular standard height. And I keep thinking about this because many companies will take the shortcut to build the one height sink and then later install the horrible
That's
step.
more expensive.
And that's more expensive, yeah,
Much more expensive.
Yeah, because ultimately people wouldn't be using your sink properly.
Right. Or so I could have an entire evening talking about this, and I hope we get a chance to do it sometime actually. But the short answer is, if you start thinking of like the development, the life cycle when you develop stuff, there's like a Gartner paper out there that like starts talking about it in magnitudes of 10. That if you're fixing a product that's already built and you're fixing it in production and you're doing a retrofit, that is 100 times more expensive than designing it, in the first place without that sort of problem. And so in the software development life cycle, as you go further along, from left to right, it gets infinitely more expensive to make those sorts of corrections. So really, you want to make those corrections as far to the beginning of this, as far left as possible. So there's an expression in the accessibility community which is shift left, which is all about that. But yes, I would love to come back sometime and give a whole talk on shift left, because there's all kinds of economics to this. And once you really take that into account the right way, then you start looking at any sort of solution where you don't build in from the beginning, you start looking at it as just wasteful. And so once you start embracing that sort of point of view, as a product manager, as middle management, as a business decision maker, then not testing for accessibility just seems reckless and stupid. So, no, but I hope I answered your question well enough for tonight. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm going to mute myself and dip out for a quick second. I'll be right back.
Also, oh, sorry, Alberto.
No, go for it. I was gonna say we're here if you guys need anything in the meantime, answer any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself, but Kat, go ahead.
No, thanks. So, João, before you joined the team, one thing that we came to realize through conversations and research with some of our partners was that when this work starts, and it's not to plug, but hey, shit, if the shoe fits, like the selling point for Stark is that we get in early, right? And so the research that we did with our partners, integration partners, is that when this work starts at the design phase, it actually decreases compliance errors for engineers by about 40%. And so that gives you a solid baseline on what to start with. And when you look at what 40% converts to in terms of like return on investment for resources, time, it's a shit ton of money. So just harping on what Claudio said and why it just pays to start at the beginning. And anything else realistically is asked backwards.
You're not gonna, even what Raquel just mentioned, this quote from Frank Lloyd Wright: "You can use an eraser on the drafting board or a sledgehammer on the construction site." So,
amazing.
I mean, that perfectly illustrates what are we trying to do and when are we trying to do it. Actually, I'll be a little bit anecdotal right now about the first time I interacted with Claudio as an audience member. He was offering a talk, and he had this hold on, I don't know if I'm spoiling anything, Claudio. I was going to talk about how early you should jump into it.
Go for it.
Blink twice if I should shut up. So one thing that was really eye-opening for me, especially I'm a design manager and for the enterprise mainly, before joining here as a as a community advocate. And we're always planning, strategizing. So I live less in Sketch and Adobe XD and much more on spreadsheets and it's sort of like planning with the VP and this and that. And one of the things that was really eye-opening to me about that talk from Claudio was realizing that the farther you get into and start thinking about accessibility, you should, you know, very much like somebody, I think it was Kat that mentioned it in the chat, that even at the prototyping stage, you know, you should really be thinking about this. The more that you wait into your process and the more built, so to speak, that your product is, the more expensive it is to fix and retrofit and then go back. And you're looking at a massive, you know, when you're planning your budget, it's a massive, massive thing to think about. If you do it after the fact, you know, it's a lot more expensive to attack it then. So, you know, I fully empathize with this quote, and it's something that we, you know, it's part of our mission, really.
Yeah, Raquel, you get the quote of the night award here. But yeah, let me go back one slide. I mean, if you look at the stuff in the CVAA here, I mean, this isn't stuff that you're going to solve in prototyping. This is stuff that you're going to have to deal with when you're journey mapping, like really at the beginning of the process to handle this well. Or at the very least, you know, you're going to have to start handling this stuff as personas. Can I say how awesome it is to be in a room full of designers here and be able to like actually do this and not alienate most of my audience? This is like so good that we can have this conversation as designers here.
And developers.
Right? But still, this is like, you know, if I were talking about this, you know, to the other folks on my accessibility team or, you know, other people in corporate, I would have just kind of like left them in the dust a while ago. So this is awesome that I can get this specific and start talking about journey mapping in early stages without having to pull up the diagram and build up to it for 10 minutes. So that's awesome. It's great to have you guys here. All right, are we all back from our break? Awesome. So, hey, here we go. We're talking about personas. I think I did the cheesy sort of documentary thing where you have the thing right before the commercial break and then you come back and you replay the same thing that you had before, like your 5 minutes of commercials. So we'll skip ahead from this one. And so one of the interesting things that I did in the cruise company was I started taking this sort of running inventory of all the different sort of use cases, all the different sorts of challenges, all the different sorts of situations that we would run into in terms of who we design for and stuff. And so I started keeping this running tab. And it's like, okay, here's a CVAA. It's got your 10 commandments. Here's the 10 major use cases. But we run into more because we have guests that come on cruise ships. You're out to sea. You need to provide for their every need. Medical, prescriptions, you know, there's all kinds of situations that you run into cruise ships. And it's not like they can, you know, jump off and go to CVS for something that they need. So, you know, you have to be able to provide in the guest experience for the totality of all of your guest needs. So that also puts certain sort of burdens on the customer support teams and anybody who's guest facing and stuff that we have to consider. And there's some major brands out there that really, really actually do this well. And I would say if there's anyone I would really tip my hat off to for really coming up with inclusive design and doing service design for any situation under the sun, it would be Disney. And so think of all the sort of medical conditions, autism, whatever you have of people walking into the parks, and that staff, those people there are actually trained to handle probably some of the most difficult or impossible sort of service positions, conditions that are out there. So, which is also why my company loves poaching people from Disney, or anybody from Disney. All they have to do is mention the D word and they're in a job interview. So let's unpack, you know, what these different sorts of use cases are that we have. So we have low vision. We have low vision implies magnification, and that's a sort of assistive technology that you would use to get around it. But you also have low vision without hearing, which means that you can't use a screen reader. So that implies a whole different set of assistive technology. Or no vision, which means that you use screen readers to be able to read the content of the page to you. Now we start dealing with little or no color perception, and this could get interesting. Like for instance, color coding. You cannot have color coding without having another means of supporting that information. I had an interesting situation a few months ago. Remember the fires in Oregon, and they had evacuation maps, and they had red, yellow, and green. Well, if you had full-on color blindness, you could not tell the red from the green apart. And the red meant you need to get the fuck out now. And the green meant you should be packing and waiting for further instructions. But if you saw the map in black and white with no other information, you couldn't tell the difference. So there is the possibility of somebody making an absolute fatal error because somebody hadn't put an additional affordance to be able to give that additional piece of information. So these are sort of use cases that can potentially be catastrophic. So with vision, again, we talked about light sensitivity and being in bright surroundings. Light sensitivity, you could think of that, for instance, as a situational impairment. Like any of us who have had a crushing hangover and just cannot stand the brightness of your screen, that's like, a good use case for dark mode. But there are people who have that sort of light sensitivity 24/7. We've got hearing, whether or not you can hear, you're hard of hearing. We can talk about speech, whether you have limited or non-typical speech. So if you have a heavy accent, or you have a slur, or you have a heavier speech impediment, and you're trying to work with voice UI, that could be monumentally frustrating. And there's also the whole situation of whether or not English is your primary language. So, how do you support people who don't have English as a primary language? Captions actually are a remarkably good way of doing that, because people can learn to read a language, but they may not be able to recognize it as a spoken language. So captions allow you a second sort of modality of being able to get over that hump. So other use cases, dexterity. Can you use a mouse? What if you have severe Parkinson's and you have this wicked tremor? What does that do for your ability to work with a keyboard? Now, thankfully, there are features in Windows and the Mac OS that compensate for that. But what if you're trying to play a gaming console? Or what if you're trying to, do something else? You want to be able to build in modalities that handle tremor, shaky hands. What if you don't have a hand available to you? So you want single-handed mode. Or what if you're using gloves or a prosthetic device? Now, another area that we get into very much in terms of the cruise company that I work for is mobility. So we have this sort of like tiered system of mobility there that's pretty nuanced. It's not like you're mobile and you're immobile. You're mobile, you can use a cane or a walker to get around, or you use a manual wheelchair or walker. But the real sort of like threshold comes down to whether or not you can actually get out of your chair, take a couple steps, and get over a particular obstacle. So if you have 3 steps and you have limited mobility, well, you can get over that obstacle. You can still use an assistive device, but it's not a showstopper for you. But if you're in that 300-pound motorized wheelchair or a scooter, those 3 steps are an absolute roadblock for you. So you have this sort of different tier of mobility. And we're going to come back to this later, because the different tiers and different nuances of mobility start having other sorts of implication on your design. And then finally, and this is something that could be said for anything, where essentially if you have a disability, chances are you will need extra time to complete a task. So those people who love having or those developers that love having 60-second timers on a screen, or even 2-minute timers on a screen, just doing that and having too short of a time and not allowing for a way to extend it is an ableist practice. It's also, you also would not meet WCAG standards if you did that. So next, let's look at the whole psychological and cognitive thing. So, you know, we've had a couple conversations in Slack about, you know, whether or not there's a, you know, you have motion sensitivity or vestibular disorder. I personally term it as like feeling barfy when I do certain things. You know, I think if I walked into work and said I had a vestibular disorder, you know, my boss would look at you, well, like, oh, wow, you know, and it's self-diagnosed. It's not something you go to a doctor and they tell you, oh, you have vestibular disorder. So it's essentially some people cannot handle motion, and then our brains perceive motions in different way. And if there's a disconnect between the motion you perceive and the motion your brain has, or, you know, one way or another, it could be just simply the way a ship is rocking or something, and that produces seasickness. That disconnect can happen to anybody. And for some reason or other, scrolling down e-commerce sites like triggers it in me, no, like nothing else. Like I cannot scroll through pages and pages of product without like having to walk away at some point and just go like, I've had it. Being disoriented, having a limited attention span. What was I talking about? Having anxiety or being on the spectrum, or having, you know, limited cognitive skills. And it could be generational. I mean, my 93-year-old mother cannot for the life of her remember a password. She's like a one password kind of person, you know, that she'll share with everybody in creation, whether it's to her bank or whatever, you know. So those limited cognitive skills aren't even necessarily a mental limitation. I mean, she's this great intellectual, but it's more like that's a skill that she never really had to, you know, that she never really had to acquire. All right, let me talk about other sorts of things. And these are kind of like not things that you as designers may necessarily have to work with in the digital world, unless you're working for, you know, a company like mine. So things like having limited reach, being a little person, being too large, being too heavy. You know, we've had guests that weigh 650 pounds and are concerned about the furniture being able to hold them up. And there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to cruise. So, you know, it starts getting into how do you service design for folks that, you know, exceed the size allowances of the furniture and the fixtures that you have. Or people who have limited strength, they're easily fatigued. Food allergies are a huge issue for us because people don't have alternative places to eat when they're out to sea. Or underlying medical conditions. Like for instance, we have a dialysis at sea program. So even if you had late stage kidney disease, you would still be able to cruise with our cruise line. It'd be expensive. You'd have to rent the equipment. You'd have to go and have dialysis regularly while you're on board, but you would still be able to cruise. And then there's gender, and we should have a gender night, which we talk about this exclusively, you know, whether or not you're trans, you're gender non-binary, gender non-conforming. So you may be thinking to yourself, okay, how do I, as a UX designer, think about this? You know, like what is the relevance? We'll get to this in a little bit, so trust me. But these are, you know, this gives you an idea. This goes way beyond the sort of list of the 10 use cases, you know, that the CVAA gives. The other thing is, like, for those of us who still believe in personas, like you know, if you're going to do 30 personas, you're going to totally lose your audience. I mean, they're going to start getting frustrated. So that's really kind of like a you know, not really an option that you have available for you. Next, those of us who are art directors or creative directors, how do we portray disability? So first thing that we need to do is, before we go bragging about how well and how, you know, woke we are and how wonderful we think of disabilities, like we just have to make sure that we don't screw up on the basics. Delta, I mean, they stumbled into this one with both feet first. Oh my God. You know, they ran this beautiful campaign and it says, you know, we believe in making the world a smaller place for everyone. And they have this kid, you know, who has trouble walking. He's got an obvious disability. And they're talking about how wonderful, you know, Delta is for people with disabilities. Except for the fact that their baggage handlers are absolute brutes with wheelchairs. And, you know, I think they did a survey, and I think Delta was up to like 1 in 5 wheelchairs that they were breaking. So 1 in 5 times wheelchairs that they handled broke in transit because of the poor handling that they had. So for them to go and brag about, you know, how they were making the world smaller for people with disabilities, it's an outrage. I mean, they're just completely screwing up. So the moral of the story is, if you want to go bragging about how woke you are and how good you are with people with disabilities, first rule, fix your shit. You know, make sure you don't have accessibility issues. Make sure that you don't have like serious gaps in your service design. Go do an audit like holistically on what you're doing before you go and start beating your chest. So let that be a lesson. Next, okay. iStock photo. Now, mind you, the only reason this has the iStock watermarks on this is because I was too cheap to buy them. But iStock has probably some of the most inclusive photography out there. But this is something you should never, ever do, which is you should never have abled models standing in for people with disabilities. You know what? You know, people talk about black face, brown face, what have you. That's what this is, okay? So having models who are not disabled posing like they have a disability is an outrage. And this is something you should never be doing. So, you know, in this case, they just kind of like, hey, let's just shoot some pictures one way. Oh, let's just shoot some pictures another way. And people will pick up on things on the fact that this is the wrong type of wheelchair. You know, like, okay, this is a medical wheelchair that you would use for like pushing Nana around because she can't roll herself. I mean, this guy looks like he's, you know, able enough to roll himself. So why do you have the little tiny back wheels? Why don't you have the larger wheels? People notice that stuff. So you have to be attentive. So you want to have portrayals of people with disability that are honest, and you don't want to really, you know, resort to this. Here's another example, okay? This woman is like, oh my God, thank you. I was helpless until you came and helped push me, okay? This is not the way you want to portray people with disabilities. Now, I know Sherry's lurking in here. She's probably biting her tongue someplace, going like, yeah, this is ridiculous. Disability etiquette, you do not touch someone's wheelchair or device unless you've asked them first and they granted you permission. And if he was touching her chair, it wouldn't be to lean on it this way for the photograph. It would be actually to be pushing her someplace purposely. So this is kind of odd. The other thing, and this is the thing that really pains me. This picture, if you look at the server's baggy pants, are probably from the late 90s. This is probably the last time a photo was commissioned with a person in a wheelchair for this particular brand. So this is the last photo that this brand commissioned of somebody. So if you want to, yes, you can go to stock, but if you want to have brand specific photography, you need to commission that photography, and you need to get that cycle started now, because you're probably not going to be able to use that photography for another year or so. So if you don't raise that stink as a designer, as a creative director, if you don't write those creative briefs that mandate that sort of photography, what's going to happen? It's going to be 2020. You look at the photography from 1998, you're not going to want to use it. Or you're going to run into this sort of, you're going to be, you know, kind of like you're going to be perpetuating this sort of ableism, because people are going to see like, hey, look at these sexy, awesome models, you know, that are shot beautifully and recently. And then here are these crusty, horrible stock photos, you know, from the 1990s of people with disabilities. And you're going to have this sort of marketing disparity in terms of how you portray those two groups. So no, I mean, we as art directors, we as creative directors need to stand in and start demanding that photography, you know, happens that's more inclusive. So how do you handle that sort of more inclusive photography? Well, first of all, you don't portray somebody as being needy and dependent. You know, here, for instance, you know, there is the active disabled. And, you know, as this guy is scooting, you know, with his friend here down a paved trail through the vineyards, Or, you know, is one thing that I was proposing, you know, internally was like having explorers with disabilities. So portraying people, yeah, they have disabilities, but they're still badasses. They still like to travel, and they can, you know, still like somehow manage to roll out on that rock, you know, by the ocean there. So you don't want to necessarily portray people as helpless, and you don't want to portray them as not being able to get out or do anything. So another way of doing it is to be subtle, okay? And this is kind of like when Hollywood had the code and you would kind of display gay characters or LGBT characters, and it wasn't on the surface, it was kind of on the DL. So this is really probably one of the best and most effective ways of portraying people with disabilities in your photography. So if you look on the right, from the same photo shoot, you have this guy who rode in on his bike to the beach to meet his buddies. They have this bonfire, and he happens to have a prosthetic foot. So I can tell you from seeing other images from the shoot that the bike belongs to the guy with the prosthetic foot. Now, is this image all about the prosthetic foot? Is it all about that character? Is it all about like a really obvious thing like a wheelchair? No. It's just kind of worked in there. Just the same way as, you know, back in the days of the code, you would have probably worked in an LGBT character, you know, into a movie. So that is a really effective way of handling that in terms of your art direction. Now, you may not be able to see with a young woman on the left in the striped beach chair. She has a hearing aid. So that's something that you could work into a photo shoot, but it's not jumping up and down on you. You know, it's not like, you know, in your face. It's subtle. So that's, if you have, for instance, you know, product owners or management that's a little bit queasy about like making this too in your face, there are ways to work this in. One of the things, you know, it would have taken me a little bit more research to do, and maybe we can have another night just on art direction or just on photography and stuff like this. But there, you know, over the last year or two, there has been enormous progress in terms of the quality of stock photography and the portrayal of people with disabilities. So there are entire agencies that are devoted to this. Definitely do your research, start looking at this, but even the mainstays like iStock Photo, Getty, Alamy, all of them have really started opening this up. So don't use like diversity and inclusion or that as a keyword or as a path to look at this. You're going to have to find, you know, use certain keywords like maybe wheelchair is your way of searching for this, and then you kind of go sideways and start looking at more photography like this. But it's there, and the quantity that is of the photography that's there has probably increased tenfold in the last 2 years. So that is, you know, that is something you should definitely be looking for. This for me is like the kid in the candy store part, where we start talking about like really cool tech that's out there and assistive technology. And for me, who was born early enough not to be a digital native, like to me, some of this stuff is just like magical. It is like science fiction coming to real life. But before we get into it, let's talk about data models, okay, and how we leverage our technology. And remember, we mentioned gender, and this starts getting into thorny issues because most of our data models have binary gender worked into them. So those of us who are lucky enough to be working very early stage with the engineers, with the data architects, we need to architect into the systems ways of handling fields that relate to people with disabilities. So it could be the different tiers of mobility stuff. It could be how you handle gender, you know, and it starts raising all these other issues. Like gender is such a thorny issue that unless gender is absolutely core to your service model and absolutely core to how you handle people, you shouldn't ask for it. So this started a really interesting conversation that I was having on Slack earlier today. This is a campaign that Citibank just launched. which allows, if you're trans, you're allowed to have another field in your data model for your preferred first name. Okay, so you don't have to use your legal birth name on your card. So it's not like you're walking into a store and you're pulling out a credit card that has a man's name, but you're a trans woman and you present yourself as a woman and the clerk looks at you, go like, whose card did you steal? Okay, the preferred first name allows you to go into a store and have that sort of trust. Now, I was like, wait, isn't this like a poor proxy for being able to somebody to go in and self-service and being able to change their vendor on their profile? And actually what came out was that Citibank doesn't use gender. They don't need to know if you're male or female so you can bank with them. And that's really the way most of our businesses should be. Unless gender is core to how you're operating with them, unless it's really crucial, it actually doesn't belong in your data model. But if you do have it in your data model, it needs to be flexible. It needs to be flexible in this way. It's not binary gender. So you could say, well, what is the right way to portray gender? Well, the problem is that we haven't really come up with a way that we all agree upon for portraying gender. So it's kind of like you have to plan your data model in a way that you're ready to switch from binary gender to like maybe female, male, other, prefer not to say, which seems to be the current trend, to then years down the road to whatever we're all going to finally settle on. But you have to like plan for those sort of two migrations in your data model in terms of how you handle gender. But you can't really get away with, you know, having your head in the sand and being an ostrich and sticking to binary gender.
Yeah, somebody asked a question that I think it's important and in context with this, which is what happens when companies are using that binary answer to verify something, let's say against your passport or against, you know, your government issued ID. What can we do in those cases? You know, especially for travel, we're in the cruise industry, but also any sort of like travel and hospitality, they do rely, anything that deals with international has to deal with, you know, whatever is in either on your birth certificate, or like how can we still implement things like that without being exclusive of people?
I think the short answer is it's going to be a journey. You know, we're not going to solve this. We're not going to get this right overnight. You know, I think it's a matter of getting it right in a few instances like this, the Citibank campaign, and then having that evolve and change. But Christ, I mean, I was born in an era that was about as homophobic as you can get. And then to have trans people being openly trans and being accepted and talking about it, you know, and that I've seen this in my own lifetime is amazing. So it is a journey. You know, it is something that, you know, we can't look necessarily at the glass as being half empty. We just have to look at it as being full and it getting a little bit more full, you know, with every year that passes. So, all right. So this is the gender issue. Now let's talk about different sorts of modalities and different ways that you can design your digital experiences. So one of the biggest issues that we run into is friction around data entry. And so we've built, you know, people complain about how crappy AI is, artificial intelligence, but those algorithms and the AI and cookies and all that sort of information that they take from you, which, you know, has an adverse effect on your privacy, also reduces the amount of time that it takes you to do data entry. And so for people who can't maybe work a mouse or can't work a keyboard, let's explore a couple different ways of being able to do data entry. Now, this is images from a project on GitHub that this 25-year-old kid developed a way of using your webcam to then use facial recognition. So you essentially can operate a mouse with your head tilt and your head's position, and then using smiles as essentially your click event. And so if I had, like, say, you know, late stage ALS and the only thing I can move is my head, this library is open source, it's out there on GitHub, and this is something that I would be able to apply as a different sort of modality for making my app useful. So I'm not saying that this library is the be all and end all necessarily, but there are more like this. And so for those of us who are developers, I mean, this is stuff that we should look into. You know, what is the state of the art out there? Because it is like over the last 2 or 3 years, it's exploded and it's become so much more advanced. So between the advances with the improvements in webcams, the availability and the APIs to tap into that, and the, you know, being able to use JavaScript or being able to use other technology to tap into that and have it as open source is amazing. I mean, we should be able to take much more advantage of this than we have. Here's another different sort of thing, which is eye gaze. So it's, you know, think of facial recognition as a static way of recognizing your face, but eye gaze is a combination of infrared and looking at your pupils to see where they're pointing. And essentially the rig that you see on the left, for instance, is a rangefinder at the bottom. At the top, there's like the infrared beam. So the rangefinder gives you different points of view so that it can detect how in 3 dimensions where your eyes are pointing. And so determine that so that then you can use your eyes as essentially as a cursor. Now, for those of you who are gamers, just imagine how dangerous you could be, you know, if you just could use your eyes, you know, to point where you are. But the screen you're looking at here is actually a setup screen for, you know, it's like a configuration screen on the left for, you know, okay, we're tracking the eyes. Okay, we're just configuring and we're fine tuning where that's pointing to. But once you get it up and running, and it takes like maybe 3 to 5 minutes tops to be able to do this, then you're essentially able to use your eye gaze as a cursor. And that's really, really powerful. We just probably haven't figured out a way to do this. And that particular solution that you have there, that rig, maybe is about $400 worth of hardware, but it retails for about $8,000. So, you know, there's significant markup on those products because they're treating them as like bespoke specialty products for a limited audience, where really these could be used as broader sort of products for a larger audience. But this is something that you should be thinking of and keeping in the back of your head. This,
Claudio, real quick, we have about 15 more minutes, so I just want to make sure that we have enough time to do Q&A also. So
okay.
Just bear that in mind. Yeah.
Okay. This is really where the rubber hits the road, where you have all the assistive technology and it's built into the operating system, and you have the ability to tap into this with your apps. So your apps, really, if you're building and you're coding, you want that to work and play nicely with the assistive technology that's built into your systems. So here, for instance, you see how you see the system preferences and the accessibility features in the Mac, but you've got decades of products that are unlike their nth generation that are tried and tested. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Make sure that your stuff plays nicely with this technology, because you know what? This is what people with disabilities are going to be using. They're not going to want to use your accessibility overlay. They're not going to want to be using your widget. They don't want to use something specifically for your website or your digital experience. They're going to want to use something that basically is universal for the world. So this is really where you should be focusing your efforts. All right, real quick. Another cool example technology, Amazon Echo. In this case, this woman who has limited vision has a can of a product, and Alexis is able to read to her what the contents are of that can that she has. It also works for medications. So this is a real inexpensive product, and you have these sort of capabilities built into it. This was a runaway hit about 1.5 years ago, where Microsoft developed this product, this Xbox controller that you could use in different ways. You didn't have to have 2 hands with 2 opposable thumbs and have full manual dexterity in order to play games. And this Xbox controller was a runaway hit. But the real secret to this is not that design. The real amazingness to us, on the back, they have 19 of these 3.5 millimeter jacks where you could plug it into anything, and this device starts becoming a hub for everything else. So this is really where, you know, where the juice is with the Xbox controller. So really it's not just about building a product that's accessible. It's even better if you can build a product that's accessible and that plays nicely with other assistive technology. And really, like, we as designers should take the time to study the assistive technology and to learn it, because some of the stuff is actually really pretty amazing. And if you can take some of that stuff and use it for abled people, then you can start coming up with like different sort of modalities and amazing different ways of using your tech. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up with next steps as a designer. All right, first of all, if you're coding or if you're building stuff, try out some testing tools. Wave is the best one for beginners. Disclaimer, I actually worked on the Wave project in terms of like building an icon library for them. So if you download Wave now and you see all those little icons, that was a project that I did in Figma a few years ago when I was just getting into accessibility. The other thing I want to say is that I did that as if it were an open source project, and Wave is not open source. And I basically built the icon library and kind of like contributed that the same way I would as an open source project. So the fact that something isn't open source is like, don't let it stop you from contacting the manufacturer or the builder of this or the author and contributing your stuff anyway, because it is a tremendous community service that we as designers can do. Next up, if you're a developer, Axe by DQ is amazing. And if you're managing a dev team, you should train them into building code that's Axe clean. So that allows you to basically eliminate all of the coding accessibility issues before something goes into testing or production. It's like running spell check, okay? On an enterprise level, you've got something like Site Improve, where it'll scan an entire site, it'll save the data, and then there's different ways of mining and looking at that data to see where your different points are. I work with all three of these on a regular basis, and I strongly recommend every single one of them. Where would we be without talking about Stark here? So if you're going to check something, you know, let's check some color contrast here. So this is an outstanding tool. Make use of it. And the fact that it works in your dev environment, whether it's Figma, Sketch, is just an added plus. Get yourself familiar with WCAG. You don't necessarily have to read through WCAG, but get yourself familiar with this, because this is the de facto standard. And WCAG comes in 3 flavors. It comes in A, AAA, and AA. And really, A is just kind of like, it's the real, you know, just the low-hanging fruit. But nobody looks at that anyway, because the legal standard is actually AA. So that's kind of like the Goldilocks point between AAA, which is a, you know, a more extreme and tight standard, and AA. When do you want to use AAA? You want to use it where if something was not accessible, then the results would be catastrophic. So we talked about, for instance, the emergency communications in Oregon for the fires. Like, that is a use case in which you would want to be up to AAA standards. Just like, you don't usually see your sign language interpreters every time a politician speaks, but when they're announcing, you know, evacuation plans for a hurricane, that's when they come out. Exactly. This is the same sort of thinking with AAA. You want to use AAA when accessibility, not having it, could be catastrophic. I have a list of common mistakes. These are like, you know, top 9 things that, you know, can really get you in trouble and can really, you know, affect your, you know, can put you at legal risk. Just about every single one of these are things that are detectable with automatic testing. Hidden focus is a little bit more difficult. You have to do manual testing for that. But the other ones pretty much, you can use the tools that I mentioned earlier to get to this. I have a resources slide in here with links on how to educate yourself. I have a link to the Inclusive Design Toolkit, different certification programs and stuff. If you look me up, Claudio Luis Vera, and you look me up on SlideShare, this deck is up there. You can download it and you can get links to this. What is another aspect or another thing that you can do? If you haven't joined the Slack community, do. Okay, and the other thing is I hang out on this a lot. All of us hang out on this a lot, maybe more than we should. But if you want to like strike up the conversation or pick up the conversation after tonight, and we don't have time in the Q&A to do this, this is the place to do it. So start-community.slack.com, and I would love to catch up with all of you that I haven't had a chance to catch up with tonight because I've done all the talking. So please, I hope I get a chance to see you guys there. And with that, let's open it up to Q&A.
Claudio, oh my God, you're amazing. First of all, I do want to mention we were using Ref live captions and they seem to have stopped after 2 hours, which is terrible. Kat, if you don't mind letting people know that captions will be available in the YouTube post after we're done with this. So we'll, apologies. The end of this will be fully captioned over there. Claudio, I have a question. This one is coming from myself, but it's really an extension of what Glenn asked before when we were talking about Hyperloop. But what really struck me was two things. Number one is when you were talking about Delta and their advertising, and number two, knowing that the UK implemented a new ruling for all government and public access websites to be fully compliant with AA standards. And if they're not, even if they're not full AA compliant, that they have a disclosure of basically, here's where we are today, and here are all the things detailing, here are all of the things that we know that we have to work on. And my question is, how can we limit maybe the I don't want to be offensive here, but the cancel culture mentality of immediately like judging a company like, you haven't done 100% great, and maybe be more accepting and even help aid them in the way to become not only compliant, but fully accessible. We know that compliant is just a really low bar. How can we contribute to that without being like, oh yeah, you're advertising like this, well, you suck and you haven't done your job right, or anything like that?
Well, I mean, tonight isn't like you suck and you should never do this. I mean, I think a lot of it really comes down to being human, Alberto. I mean, it really comes down to being more understanding, and it is a journey. And you and I both have probably experienced like something that could be a 2-hour fix could take you 2 months of selling the right product manager to be able to make that fix. And I know there are people here who in the crowd tonight that think very differently about this. Like, but wait a minute, it only takes 2 hours to fix. It could take you 2 months of lobbying somebody to allow you to have the 2 hours of extra resources to make that fix. And there is, a lot of sort of issues that we run into are really systemic to how we, how corporations work, or just blatantly the lack of awareness. I wish we could do a quick show of hands of like, how many of you are hearing of accessibility or discrimination in this light for the first time tonight? Because this is, I'm not allowed to use the D word at work. My boss would throw up in his mouth if I gave it to work.
This is actually a very good segue to Celine's question, talking about when joining an organization, especially as a new designer. If I join an organization and I see that digital accessibility is being disregarded, how can I make my voice heard, especially being somebody that is new to the team? Do you have any quick tips for that?
Yes. As in make your voice heard. No, I mean, I don't want to be really flip, but I mean, really, it kind of starts coming into like, it's almost like, how do you have a conversation with a racist relative at the Thanksgiving table? You know, how do you have that conversation where you actually set yourself up to have a dialogue that leads to cultural change, as opposed to an outrage conversation that immediately sets you down an adversarial path? You know, and for me, like, I can have this conversation with you folks in part because I had a career for 20 plus years as a creative director that committed all these sins. So I know exactly where we've dropped the ball, and I know exactly how, as a designer, I didn't meet. So, but having that humility of like, okay, you know what? This is wrong. We need to fix this as a common problem, as opposed to a sin that the other person is doing, and or a crime that they're committing. And so it's a very different kind of conversation that takes some good communication skills. I think one of the biggest ones is probably active listening, you know, where you actually don't close yourself and you're not preaching to the other person. You're actually able to like listen to their concerns. Like, for instance, you know, running into a PM that'll tell you, no, we can't work accessibility into the cycle because they're concerned about budgets. And then you might realize that whatever time that they're spending on accessibility actually comes from their generosity and the kindness of their heart, because they have to steal it from something else, you know, on the product team, and being able to have that sort of compassion and understanding for the PM that's saying no to you. I mean, so a lot of how that works comes down to how you frame that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Marcelo asks, how important and urgent do you think it is for designers to learn about WCAG and best practices?
Whew, I wish we could all learn it yesterday, but no, seriously, it's a journey. I'm really grateful that I've been able to share this with you guys tonight. I'm really grateful that you folks are, you know, been able to like kind of like join into this and be able to start understanding these. How urgent is it? It's urgent. It's important. You know, the longer that we take to do this, the longer it's going to take this cultural change to happen. But you know, again, culture change is not something that happens overnight. You know, Rome wasn't built in a single sprint. And, you know, we also have to kind of like arm ourselves with patience for this.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there's a big gap in education. I've shared with Kat many times and with the rest of the community that I went through. I graduated from graphic design originally, went through a large portion of my career without ever hearing anything about accessibility, without even thinking that I was putting all kinds of, and even creative directing, all kinds of terrible products, you know, like going out there. And I think this is my path of redemption right now, you know, joining this team, co-hosting these events and really trying to learn as much as possible. Because the truth of the matter is right now, it feels like education is failing us in that regard. Even the way that we think about businesses and set up budgets, all of those aspects are really failing us. And right now, the path to build a better world for everyone seems to be submitting ourselves to doing a whole lot of homework and being hard-headed and being like, I'm going to do my own research. I'm going to learn about this. I'm going to engage in like really uncomfortable conversations with my boss. And honestly, from my perspective, so be it. You know, I'm here for it. But I do think the more that we learn about this, the more that we look at these, everything that we have to do, and the more that we can preach it, the more effective we're going to be at creating the change that is needed, so that curriculums are transformed, so that institutions start teaching this from the get-go, so that whenever they're planning a new product or there's a new startup that blips in Silicon Valley, they're thinking, all right, this is part of what we have to do. We're building our design system. We have to include accessibility as a foundation for everything that we're doing, etc. So I think you guys even being here asking these questions and everything, it warms my heart because this is my journey as well. So selfishly, I'll say that I learned so much from your questions, from Claudio being able to answer some of these things, and really the perspective and the introspection that results from even reading some of these questions. So truly, thank you so much. Any other questions? Anybody? Open mic. You feel free to shout it out.
Hello, Claudio. Ruben Nick. I'm an accessibility engineer at Webflow. This is less of a question and sort of just a little bit of an open dialogue I want to have with you. I'm really happy that you provided a lot of different arguments for accessibility. I'm super happy that you specifically called out ableism. I was counting 8 times. But I'm
Only 8?
really, I might have missed a few. I definitely probably missed a few. But I'm really not a fan of the situational or eventual view of accessibility because, while it's like, oh, we all get older, oh, my lovable granny, it puts the focus on abled individuals, right? And if you're not focusing on the disabled, if you're not focusing on the actual audience, I think the best you can do is merely compliance.
I disagree.
Okay, yeah.
I disagree. So I have, like, for instance, a whole series of webinars that I've built up in my company. And, I approach this as I have a whole program called Everyday Accessibility. And so what I do is I talk to people about assistive technology that's built into Windows, it's built into Microsoft Office, and ways in which they can use this in their everyday lives. So the sort of theory that I have about this is, if you teach abled people about assistive technology and they start embracing and using assistive technology, then they're going to expect it to work always for them. And when they run into a situation where they find something that doesn't work with them, they're going to feel the same sort of outrage, as somebody with a disability. So I do understand, where you're coming from, and it's a different sort of moral ground, to be at, Nick, where, it's a different place to come from, where it's not as pure as working for people with disabilities. But I kind of approach a lot of stuff with accessibility in terms of, like, hey, I'll take what I can get. If I can get people to be really motivated about accessibility, even though it's selfish, that's okay. If you think about an economist, economists think about things in terms of aligned incentives. The more I can align incentives between the mainstream and assistive technology manufacturers and people with disabilities, the more I can align those incentives together, and the more mainstream accessibility becomes, the more successful we're going to be. And I feel like that's where the accessibility community has actually really not been able to succeed for the last 30 years.
Claudio, can I chime in and make a quick comment to Ruben? So I really like what you just said, Ruben, because the same way you can go towards to ableism, we could go towards deepen disability. So like having designers and developers, even the WCAG, creating properties for keyboard-only applications, right? So why not sip and puff? Why not switch? So it's like this idea of segregating, right, a particular group within the usability or the disability community is also dangerous. I think we are at a time that we need to be broad, and then we can start promoting a specific application for specific disabilities when we reach a higher maturity level. So but thanks for that. So it's a very good thought.
If I can give a retort, I'm not at all advocating for segregation of folks with disability. You know, and folks with disability, oftentimes, you know, they just want to be treated human, quite honestly.
Yeah.
But right there is a premise here that I also disagree with, and that premise is that accessible design will always be better for everyone. And I think oftentimes it is. But here's the question that I have that's tied to that. What if it's not? What if it makes it uglier, right? Like, what if there is something that people push back against? Are we still willing to make those choices? Are we still willing to have those costs, right? If it doesn't benefit us. And I think if we focus on ables, I think the answer to that is no.
Ruben, I love you for throwing these hand grenades in here. You know, this is, I've seen this a lot in the design community, and I've seen a couple bloggers presenting sort of like false trade-offs between accessibility and beauty, or accessibility and design. And I personally don't buy into it, because I feel like anything could be made accessible if you threw enough resources or enough attention at it. And so really where we start running into issues of stuff not being accessible, and the serious design trade-offs are either where you have the wrong assumptions, you're building for the wrong use cases, or you're not considering accessibility and you're kind of trying to retrofit. So, you know, just like Hyperloop and the 300-pound wheelchair, really, if you take in the right challenges and you design for it properly, then it shouldn't be there. I mean, it's like it's like, you know, the bar that's in your shower. Okay, you know, you have an accessible hotel room, and you have, you know, bars that are kind of put on top of the tile in the shower. Why couldn't that be an elegant solution that's designed into the shower? It's an ugly retrofit. We have to kind of like change our thinking, where instead of thinking of like, oh, I'm making it ugly by adding accessibility features, we really need to start thinking more in terms of, you know, how do we resolve these issues, and how do we design for accessibility, or you know, or to be inclusive in a way that's beautiful and attractive, because it totally is within our capabilities. So I, you know, my first reaction when somebody says there's a trade-off because of accessibility, my first reaction is like, you're designing wrong, or you're approaching the problem wrong.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily talking about the trade-off, but I'm just saying there's still that underlying premise, right? To translate this conversation to another one, right? One that's currently happening, you know, in America with Black Lives Matter, you know, if we talk about, you know, racial policy as benefiting white people, it does. But if we talk about it as only benefiting white people, then I think we really have a problem. And I think that's the same case with disability issues, right? I think we really have to make sure that we frame it with disabled individuals in mind first and foremost. And I think without that, I really think we're bound to just stick to compliance. We can't do innovation.
Yeah, but it also has to be like, you know, it's like giving people medicine that tastes like medicine, or giving people medicine that's in like gummy bears or something, you know, like, you know, like think of PMs as kids, and they're not going to want to take this sort of medicine, you know, one way. You're just kind of disguising it as something else. And so I agree with you in the sense that it has to serve people with disabilities. I agree with you wholeheartedly, and that you can't have something about us without us, you know, that, and I hope we get a chance to have, you know, to be able to talk at some future point about how you test and how to do functional testing with people with disabilities, how to include people with disabilities in your journey mapping in your early stages. And the fact is like there's this almost like this apartheid where you have to really go out of your way as a woke product designer. You really have to go out of your way to find someone with a disability to be able to come in and advise you on a project. And you really have to go out of your way to find the blind testers for your website. And it's a real, like, if we all really were doing this right, we'd suddenly be like, oh my God, there's like not enough testers in the world to test all the products that need to be tested. But unfortunately, the testers are kind of underutilized because we haven't kind of like hit that stage yet in terms of maturity to hire them and to include them. And so we're just not there yet as a society.
I definitely agree with that. Thank you for having this conversation with me. The last thing that I want to end with is I really loved your line, "When was the last time you saw a beautiful walker?"
I did find one for my mother, but it took me months of looking. And it's something that could be designed as beautiful as a racing bike.
And that's not difficult, right? Like, I think there was this whole conversation that was happening in the design community at some point. I think it was like earlier in the year or last year, and I blew an absolute fucking gasket because there was this entire conversation around this accessibility, beauty paradox, and it was just like, no, there's no paradox to that. And we need to put this to the side. Because it's our job as designers to find this middle ground between it being accessible to everyone and accessibility being, we have this discussion internally that it's accessible because it's usable, and it's usable because it doesn't exclude anyone based on their gender or socioeconomic profile or disabilities or whatever. And it's our job to make sure that we find the middle ground between it being just this really beautiful, as beautiful as a Leica camera, as much of a companion as a Leica camera, and you can look at it and marvel at it, and it is beautiful because it is made. Form follows function every time. It is the premise of our entire job. Form follows function, and so you often look at things and you're like, well, there's no what is it? This je ne sais quoi to it, right? It's not flashy, and it doesn't have all these diamonds. And it's like, well, it doesn't need to. It's beautiful because it got someone to cross the goddamn street and didn't get them killed. That is beautiful.
Right.
One less person died.
But the reason why these things aren't developed beautifully is because we're just reflecting the ableism in the designer in the first place. Designer is like, well, why should we design something pretty? It's just not going to be appreciated.
Yeah, and I think where it's having a lot of headway, you see a lot happening in architecture and urban planning, where because there's this sort of permanence and it's a public space, so everyone is less intimate that whatever is happening on your personal phone. I imagine it's because of that they're feeling a lot of pressure to do that. We shared a very beautiful link. These two ladies formed a company for assistive technology, because assistive technology, like, oh my God, I'm blanking out on the name. You mentioned the hearing aid earlier. They were like, well, that's an extension of my personality. Why does it have to be this plastic, gross looking beige box that doesn't even match the color of my skin because I'm a person of color, right? What if I were to design something that is more akin to jewelry and something that is a reflection of my personality? Why are people not designing it this way and saying, like, let's do just enough, even if it's god awful, this huge contraption hanging from my ear? So they actually won a prize, and I think the world needs more people like that. The world needs more people like that. And I definitely agree with what Ruben said in terms of, putting them front and center and working with people with disability, or giving them, not giving them the reins, but allowing them to create these beautiful products, because honestly, we could all be better with them. But the fact of the matter is that it is only fair that they have this opportunity to interact with beautiful products that are really conscious of them being part of the population and humans without being exclusive, which is the whole thing that Claudio started with.
But the world doesn't need more people like that. We are the people like that. It's just more like we just need to focus more in terms on projects that really have that serve this totally underserved community. I mean, there's just like the societal disrespect for projects that relate to prosthetic devices and people with disabilities, or even or towards accessibility. I mean, we have this construct in our head that if we're going to do something, it's ugly, because everything we've seen in a hospital that is like medical equipment or medical aids has been ugly, and it has been under-designed. And so really the important thing is for us to kind of like lose that bias and look at that as an unconscious bias that's just right up there with flat out racism, that we as designers need to look at hey, these products are opportunities. These are opportunities for us to shine as designers, or basically any application we work is an opportunity for us to shine as a designer. And accessibility isn't the way we're going to ruin our application to make it ugly. It's more like we've got to do better discovery, we've got to do better research on our product, and it's basically our gateway to making a much more useful product that really works for everyone. But we are those people that can make that happen.
Amazing. Well, we're about 15 minutes past, so I wanna be able to wrap up, but I do want to say once again, thank you all so much for participating, asking questions. Claudio, I don't even have words to describe it, man. I'm so grateful for you being able to come here, contribute, offer up all of your knowledge. There's so much to think about. I can think of at least 1,000 other conversations that we can grab tangentially from what you just presented tonight. So again, huge thanks, and thank you for just being open to have these conversations, these dialogues. The conversation will continue. We're gonna have a monthly series, so feel free to hit us up. I put the links up before on Meetup. Definitely join our Slack group. I mean, more than what we can offer is as a start group. I think is the community itself, keeping the knowledge fresh, answering questions and everything else. You can follow us also on Twitter and Instagram. We're posting there regularly. And then on YouTube, we want to get to 100 subscribers so that we can get the same vanity URL. So please, if I can leave you with anything, let it be that. Subscribe to us on YouTube. Kat, is there anything that you want to add?
I think you all covered it. I mean, everyone, Ruben, Johnny, Catherine, Raquel, I mean, everyone, I can't even go through the list of Carlos, everyone who asked something or said something or contributed or just came in and learned. I can't thank you enough, seriously, from the bottom of my heart. I say this till I'm blue in the face. You're probably all sick of hearing it, but this would not be nearly what it is, and we could not do what we do on a regular basis without your input. So thank you 7 times to the moon and back. Thank you for everything and for actually giving a shit.